Refrigerants are these very specific type of greenhouse gas used in air conditioners, refrigerators, aerosol cans. The peculiar thing about these gases is that they're thousands of times more potent relative to carbon dioxide on a ton per ton basis. They're a pretty good set of interventions that we could implement in order to mitigate this problem. And in the world of climate, as we all know, whenever we have something that we can do so easily and at reasonable cost, it's important that we do it.
Greetings, Tilden, and welcome, and thank you for joining us for this episode.
Thanks so much for having me, James. Happy to be here.
I would like to have you just jump right in. What gets you excited to be working on refrigerants of all things? Why refrigerants? What about this has drawn you to it, gets you frankly excited to do this kind of work?
Sure. I'll preface by saying that I've been interested in refrigerants for about 4 years now. This really emerged out of a high school project. And at the time, I was a high school student in Ithaca, New York, and I loved the environment, I loved nature, and I was concerned about climate change. And I really had no pre-existing interest, to be honest, in refrigerants. I didn't know what they did, what they were. And I also didn't really have any pre-existing concern about global cooling. I didn't really understand the threat. But I read this report from Project Drawdown, which is a climate science organization that publishes information about the biggest climate issues and where to allocate our resources and time. And refrigerants actually topped the list. And I was thinking to myself, I mean, come on, I haven't heard of this refrigerant thing before. Why is it so serious? And what can I do to help? So I was really lucky. A climate organization in town called Sustainable Tompkins, with the generosity of a donor named Dr. Tim Harris, opened up this youth climate challenge for students in high school to apply into and work on a climate-related project. So with my friend Abigail, I co-founded this organization called Keep It Cool Tompkins, which worked on refrigerant management issues. And I'll say that there are a couple interesting things about refrigerants that really were compelling. First, refrigerants are these very specific type of greenhouse gas used in air conditioners, refrigerators, aerosol cans. And we often don't think about these gases that really power cooling in our world. But when you think about it, all of these gases, all of us in this world rely on them for good food and safe food, cool homes during the summertime, and a whole host of other things, even like insulation foam that uses these gases too. And the peculiar thing about these gases is that they're thousands of times more potent relative to carbon dioxide on a ton per ton basis, meaning that over a given period of time, about 3,000 tons or several thousand tons of carbon dioxide is equivalent to just 1 ton of emissions of this dangerous refrigerant gas called hydrofluorocarbon, HFC. And there are other refrigerants that we can get into later. But this was really scary to me, just like this prospect of having this invisible, odorless, colorless, but extremely potent gas lurking in all of our refrigerators and air conditioners. And according to everyone else who is already working on this issue, there seemed like there are a pretty good set of interventions that we could implement in order to mitigate this problem. So it was a combination of both the potential impact, the scariness of all of it, and also the possible interventions that we can make. And in the world of climate, as we all know, whenever we have something that we can do so easily and at reasonable cost, it's important that we do it. So that's
Absolutely.
kind of how I got into it.
Fantastic. I want to, before we go on to what you're doing in terms of the problem with refrigerants, the climate, the global warming potential that they have, as you so wonderfully outlined. The other piece of this, do you know, like methane, for example, methane is similar, where it's sort of the lesser known cousin of CO2, more potent in terms of its greenhouse capabilities, essentially. But with the other interesting fact that if you can stop emitting it, it gets out of the atmosphere faster. This is right. Methane, where if we can stop methane emissions now, we're going to have it causing problems in the atmosphere. We're going to stop causing problems faster. With the refrigerant, HFCs, are those the same? Do those do they have the long lifespan in the atmosphere that carbon dioxide does? Or if we can stop them, are they going to also kind of dissipate faster?
James, yeah, you're exactly right. And you raise a great point, which is that refrigerants, just like methane, are short-lived climate pollutants. That means they have short atmospheric lifetime relative to CO2 in the atmosphere. So while CO2 stays up there once we emit it for centuries, these gases, which are synthetic, will break down just in a period of decades. So that means that when we release an HFC molecule today, when we accidentally leak it from our refrigerators or air conditioners, or when we intentionally release it, and which we can talk about later, that gas will stay up there for a short period of time and has a concentrated climate effect in the near term. So when we're thinking about this in the broader context of climate change, about these short-lived climate pollutants like methane and refrigerant gases like HFC, and we're already seeing the harshest effects of climate change currently concentrated in the developing world and also in our own country in the United States with increased wildfires and extreme heat. It raises the question, maybe we should be looking at these short-lived climate pollutants as a way to buy ourselves more time, first to mitigate CO2 and other greenhouse gases, but also to mitigate the near-term effects of climate change, because mitigating 1 ton of these gases has a higher near-term payoff than mitigating a comparative amount of CO2. So that's kind of the thinking behind why refrigerants are important beyond just the fact that they're potent. They also have this very important near-term climate effect.
Sure. And for the audience, this is going to pair directly with some of the stuff we're about to talk about, because if you pair up this idea that it comes out of the atmosphere faster with some of the solutions that Tilden's about to talk about, I think that it becomes a rather hopeful message, I think, because it's a problem that in some ways at least is fairly readily solvable, technically at least. And if we can solve that problem, we can start to draw down, to borrow from the Project Drawdown, some of these greenhouse gases and their effects in the near term. That, again, to me is a powerful message. So on that note, Tilden, could you take us to, and to the audience, we're going to cover a couple things about how refrigerants are being dealt with. And Tilden, I'd like to start, if it's all right with you, with the dealing with existing refrigerants. Right, so we'll come to the replacement refrigerants a little bit later, if that's okay with you. Right now, let's talk about the work that you're doing there at Yale, I think, to handle how to deal with the emissions of existing refrigerants that are in our air conditioners, refrigerators, cooling trucks, warehouses, on and on and on and on.
Right. So I'll first note that refrigerant gases are housed in appliances that we use every day, like refrigerators and air conditioners. They're in there under pressure. So in theory, these gases are in a contained environment, not leaking out into the atmosphere. And we call this just all this chemical packed into our chillers and our refrigerators and our air conditioners as the installed refrigerant bank. Basically, all the chemical that's in use and kind of locked up in theory. But the problem with this installed refrigerant bank is that a little bit of it is released into the atmosphere each year from appliances and equipment already in use. So there are 3 main sources of emissions, I'd say, that we can focus on. First, during installation, when some kind of refrigerator case is installed in a supermarket, for example, there's a little bit of gas leakage out during installation. And the 2 other most impactful sources of emissions are during operating lifetime of the equipment and at end-of-life disposal. So first, we'll talk about operating lifetime emissions. And this is known as refrigerant leakage, and it occurs for a variety of reasons, some from manufacturer defects in equipment, but others just from kind of expected sources of emissions during the lifetime, like fittings getting loose, or materials degrading over time, things getting punctured on accident. And it's just a reality of operating equipment that vibrates and that is always kind of moving and working. And each year, so for example, in a supermarket, for example, we expect that, and it's legal to emit around 15 to 25% of your refrigerant bank for that supermarket each year. So whatever amount of refrigerant that you're using in a supermarket, 25% of that on average, according to the EPA, is going up into the atmosphere each year. So it's a really big source of emissions. And the third source of emissions for existing equipment is at end of life. So we think, we often at home, we never think about what happens to our air conditioner or refrigerator once we get rid of it and get a new one. But really, oftentimes, what ends up happening is it goes to the landfill. It might get crushed and release that gas into the atmosphere. And in other circumstances, this gas also ends up getting into the atmosphere just from poor disposal practices. Technicians who service this equipment sometimes release it into the atmosphere intentionally, a practice known as venting, because the incentives are really bad to responsibly recover it. And so it just turns into a whole big issue. And I'll cite a number here, which is that 90% of refrigerant in old appliances that are ready to be disposed actually ends up getting into the atmosphere. So those appliances include window air conditioners and refrigerators. So 90% of that gas in your refrigerator or air conditioner will probably escape into the atmosphere at end of life on average. And that's a big issue.
That was getting at a question I wanted to ask you, which is putting it into kind of in a scale, because I think this is also, I think the audience watching this is probably thinking this, well, okay, so I've got my refrigerator, I've got my air conditioner, or I walk by the air compressors on my campus at any given time, and you're not seeing anything escaping. And we're encountering 1, 2, or 3 or 4 of those things in our daily lives. So I think it's really hard to imagine how in the world is this little thing causing any problems.
Right.
You've gotten at it a little bit with, and now suddenly by the time that thing is used, leaks during its lifetime, and is thrown away, we're talking 90% of the gases in there going up and causing these greenhouse problems. But let's focus on I think, because it gets to the stuff you're doing at Yale, I think. Let's talk about that lifetime emissions one, because that's the one that I think is really, throwing it in the landfill and having it escape there, I think intuitively makes a lot of sense. You know, it shouldn't happen, but it's easy to see how that could happen. The leakage during its lifetime is the one where I think it seems at face value so kind of like a non-existent problem. But do you have any numbers in terms of lifetime emissions for, I don't know if it's each unit or for a campus full of, like Yale's, not to pick on Yale, but any campus's scale of units? What these hard to imagine little emissions from the shaking and vibrating, what that really adds up to.
Right. Yeah. So it kind of depends on what equipment you're talking about, and also like whether it's something really big that's on the top of an apartment building, or at a power plant that delivers chilled water to different buildings, or just something like a central air conditioner that we might have outside our homes. But I'll maybe give a couple ideas for scale here. First, the estimated emissions from about 3 central air conditioners might add up, depending on how much refrigerant you have, of course, but under standard assumptions, can total about the annual emissions of someone driving their car 11,000 miles per year. So it's and when you add up all these central air conditioners and refrigerators and air conditioners in general, just these small appliances, it really adds up. But the real kicker is when we talk about the big equipment on the tops of of apartment buildings or office buildings, also at power plants, like I was talking about. Yale, for example, has 3 main power plants that deliver chilled water to different parts of campus. That's how we cool our buildings, or that's partially how we cool our buildings. And the refrigerant that escapes out of that equipment is very, very significant, just because we're using a lot more refrigerant in that sort of large chiller equipment than in a household, for example. So there we're talking about maybe emissions of over 1,000 metric tons of CO2 per year per chiller. And when we say, okay, well, maybe the average car emits about 4 metric tons of carbon dioxide per year, driving 11,000 miles at 22 miles per gallon, we can imagine that that's a lot of cars, right? Maybe back of the envelope math here, 250 cars, 300 cars, right? And the point is that we rely on these chillers. They're everywhere. If you ever are flying kind of low, kind of almost about to touch down in a city, you can look at the tops of apartment buildings, in fact, and see all these fans and these big boxes. And you might wonder to yourself, oh, what are those? And those oftentimes are chillers they're providing cool air, chilled water. So it really is a profound issue. And that's the scale we're talking about, just single units being able to produce emissions that are very, very significant in aggregate.
It's stunning, as it adds up to far more than I think the average person would think it does. All right, so you've mentioned the big chillers at Yale and everything. So what I'd like for you to talk, if you could, a little bit about is it the Yale Refrigerants Initiative? Am I remembering that correctly?
That's correct.
So tell us about, we've defined the problem. You've told us wonderfully about what's going on here. So on your campus with the initiative you've started, what are you all doing to tackle this problem?
Sure. I'll start that. I came to Yale after doing this refrigerants project in high school, thinking that I'd set my sights on something else. But I was really lucky and fortunate because some students in student government opened up this big grant fund during my first year in college to provide funds for student projects working on energy or climate. I thought to myself, well, I wonder if Yale's doing anything on refrigerants. And I just wrote up a quick grant proposal and sent it in. And I ended up getting an opportunity to work on this project. And initially, it was targeted toward student mini fridges. So I thought to myself, well, I'm a student. I see all these mini fridges. And back when I was a first year, probably we had 3 mini fridges in our suite for 6 people. And I was thinking, I wonder what the climate impact of these fridges are. So that's where the Yale Refrigerants Initiative began. But as I started doing more research into Yale's use of refrigerants, I realized that the problem wasn't really with these student mini fridges, which maybe emit in aggregate over thousands of mini fridges, about 80 metric tons of carbon dioxide per year, which is a non-trivial but a non-significant amount in the big picture.
And I want to pause for a second, because you've said that a few times about metric tons of carbon dioxide. We're equivalent, right? The equivalent of, forgive me, just in case folks are hearing that when he's talking about the metric tons of carbon dioxide, it's the refrigerators are emitting the equivalent of those metric tons of carbon dioxide. Sorry, I just wanted to make sure.
Yeah, thanks for that clarification, James. You can kind of do some back of the envelope calculations to convert the amount of refrigerant that leaks into a metric that lines up with carbon emissions. That's our standard.
Absolutely. Yeah. Anyway, I interrupted you. Sorry. So we have the mini fridges.
Right. And I soon realized that the true problem didn't lie with mini fridges only, but instead with the bigger equipment, like dining, laboratory equipment, the freezers and refrigerators that keep specimens cool, as well as the numerous air conditioners, central AC split systems, and power plant chillers that keep our campus buildings cool. So I quickly realized that the problem was much bigger than I had ever thought. And when I realized this, I was like, well, do we even have a number that describes all these emissions? So what I did is I talked to some people on campus, and we realized that Yale had kind of an incomplete, what's known as a refrigerant inventory of equipment using refrigerants on campus. So we think of an inventory as basically a big data sheet or a collection of information that describes how much of different types of greenhouse gases we're emitting to the atmosphere per year. This process helps people plan for how to prioritize different emission sources when mitigating them. It also helps us understand our own impact on climate. And Yale had been counting the big equipment previously, so like the power plant chillers. Those are mandated. They have certain mandated reporting requirements from EPA. But Yale and basically everyone else in the United States, all institutions, don't report emissions from smaller equipment, like refrigerators and air conditioners with smaller, what's known as refrigerant charge sizes. They use less refrigerant in each unit. And you can imagine that at an institution like Yale, which is so large and expansive, and also at any institution for that matter, all these small appliances, which don't have reporting requirements, are adding up, right? So just some general observations is that all our laboratory equipment in our medical school or just in our sciences buildings actually had a larger overall impact than all our fleet vehicles on campus. So like all our buses and all our cars. And also to put that in perspective, all that stuff that wasn't being reported in our laboratories were much bigger in aggregate than the emissions from refrigerants in our power plant, which we were previously reporting and thought were the biggest source of emissions on campus. So this refrigerant inventory, actually going into the building, sometimes crawling around in the ceilings to find hidden refrigerant containing appliances and equipment, really has helped us kind of explode this black box that previously was refrigerant emissions. It helps us see how many sources there are on campus, thousands of them, and gives us a better idea of how to mitigate those emissions.
And what's the hope then? Is the hope that then the eyes turn toward maintenance, to keep the leakages from happening, or is it replacement with new refrigerants? Maybe it's too early in your initiative, I'm not sure, but what is there, this incredibly important work of documenting where it all is, which you're doing, which is fantastic. And then what's your hope going forward then with how this information will be used, or perhaps already is being used? I'm not sure.
Yeah. Well, first, inventories just allow us to have a better sense of which emissions within the bigger refrigerant emissions picture to prioritize. So for example, we might take some different approaches. So let's say we just bought a new chiller for our power plant. So this is one of the big units that provides chilled water, contains a lot of refrigerant, several thousand pounds of it in that equipment, and we just bought it. So it doesn't quite make sense to retire and replace with something using a climate-friendly refrigerant. So instead, we can say, okay, well, this is in our inventory. How does it make sense to mitigate those emissions? And in this case, it might be best to maybe put a technician on that equipment, checking it more often, install some automatic leak detectors that tell us when a leak is occurring so we can fix it really quickly. And on the other hand, for let's say we have a bunch of old appliances that we've identified in our inventory. And when we go out and collect these data, we can actually see which appliances are kind of out of date, which are older models. And we can say, okay, well, we know we're going to have to replace this equipment at some point just because it's getting old. Instead of replacing it with something using HFCs, how about we replace it with one of these some equipment using new generation refrigerants, which have low global warming potential, meaning that they don't have as high of a climate impact compared with HFCs. So there are numerous things that we can do with this information, and it really unlocks potential to have targeted approaches within the broader refrigerant emissions category.
That's amazing, and it starts to unlock in my brain, and I hope the listeners, all the other people that can start to join on to an initiative like this, like you mentioned. I'm picturing, your friends in the computer science department writing up software to track. You put those monitors on the equipment, and now they're writing software to track it and send the data to the facilities off. A lot of exciting, I think, exciting things start to bubble up in terms of how to help solve this massive leakage problem.
Right.
What I'd like to do now, though, Tilden, if it's all right, is move on to, so you're doing this wonderful work at Yale, but I think part of your initiative, if I'm not mistaken, is to now kind of spread the word, get, and I think, to other college and university campuses. Is that right? Like,
That's
show
correct.
what you're doing and sort of light the spark for others to do similar work. If I'm correct in that, could you tell us a little bit about that work?
Sure.
And what either what you've done already or what's coming down the pike?
Sure. So first of all, I'll note that refrigerants aren't a problem that are specific to Yale, and they're not really specific to any institution for that matter. Everyone relies on them in different senses, and universities perhaps rely on them more than average for laboratory, dining, and cooling. And our goal with this, yes, is to show that refrigerant management can be implemented on a wide and thorough scale in universities or institutions of higher ed that are very expansive and use a lot of refrigerants. So what we're hoping to do, and what we'll do in the next few months, is to share our process and our results with other universities. And in fact, last year in June, we presented a webinar to the Association for Advancement of Sustainability in Higher Education. And what we did there is we actually kind of mapped out what a refrigerant inventory looks like, described some of the new regulations coming down to regulate HFCs and how that might impact college campuses, gave people a better idea of what kind of power these inventories have to shape decision-making and sustainability or facilities offices. And we're planning to do something similar in the coming months as we finish up our inventory and have more substantive results to present. So that's the main thrust of it. And we also just do our best to plug into other refrigerant-related issues as well, lending our thoughts to different organizations and groups on campus.
Sure. So to the audience, we'll be placing lots of links in the description of the video with some of the things that Tilden's already been talking about and other things we haven't yet talked about. But Tilden, before we move on to the other topic under this larger category, is it okay if, I think on the Yale Refrigerant Initiative, there's a contact form to the extent that other students and other universities around the country, or I suppose the world, given our naturally global audience, reach out to you for information about the initiative, should they hope to start something similar on their campus? Is that okay?
Yeah, absolutely. And in fact, I've already had conversations with other students, including at NYU, about starting something similar on their campus. So I'm really glad to talk always. And we have other students on this campus who are interested in refrigerants too. And I can just plug people into it however they see fit and get people to respond to people's specific refrigerants questions too. So I'd be glad to.
Terrific. Now I'd like to move our sights a little bit to the future now. And we've touched on it a little bit, and you mentioned that idea of, older equipment that could be then retired in favor of newer refrigerants. Right. And to the audience, I learned about Tilden through a wonderful article he'd written while working the summer of 2021 with the National Resources Defense Council. Am I correct about that?
That's correct.
Yeah, so Tilden was working with them on their refrigerant initiatives and wrote a fantastic, in my view, is a fantastic article. I'm going to definitely link to it. I encourage you all to read it because it's a really quick but thorough hit on all of these topics related to refrigerants. So definitely check out that link. But Tilden, given the knowledge that you gained while working with NRDC and writing that article, could we talk a little bit about what's coming down the pike in terms of new refrigerants that can go into existing equipment or new equipment that don't pose the same, that mitigate some of the greenhouse gas threats of refrigerants?
Sure. Yeah. So that's a great question, and it's a really big question too. So maybe I'll first provide a little bit of context about what we're talking about in new refrigerants coming in, and why that's so significant just in this broader climate history. So in 1987, the United Nations passed the Montreal Protocol, which was this international, universally ratified treaty to phase out the use of chlorofluorocarbons and hydrochlorofluorocarbons, CFCs and HCFCs, which were these gases that depleted the ozone layer and were used as refrigerant gases. So this was the original refrigerant gas that we can think of that really had strong climate damage. And what the Montreal Protocol did is that it phased out these ozone depleting gases, which were the driver of probably the biggest environmental crisis of the late 20th century, ozone depletion. And it built a bridge to something slightly better, but still bad, called hydrofluorocarbons, HFCs, which we've been talking about throughout this interview. And these HFCs had no ozone depleting potential, but had very high global warming potential. And in fact, these CFCs and HCFCs did too, but people weren't quite focused on that back then. And so now these HFCs, which we're currently using all over the world now as replacement substitutes for these ozone depleting gases, are being phased out. So in 2016, the United Nations ratified the Kigali Amendment. And so now we're finally in 2016 in Kigali, Rwanda, where we're agreeing to phase down these HFCs over time. So what that means is that we're slowly restricting the use, meaning production and consumption of these gases through about 2040. It depends on what country you're in. It affects different countries on different timescales. But the point is, we're trying to wean ourselves off these gases. What are we replacing them with? Well, the first thing is other synthetic gases known as hydrofluoroolefins, or HFOs. These gases are often really closely related to HFCs, but have basically zero global warming potential. So they've kind of eliminated the climate effects out of these synthetic refrigerants. And so that's a suitable replacement for HFCs. And in fact, if you buy a new car today, the car air conditioner in that car will probably include HFOs, this climate-friendly substitute. We'll talk about the trade-offs with HFOs a little bit later, perhaps. And the other group of refrigerants is known as natural refrigerants. This is to distinguish them from synthetic refrigerants like HFOs. And these natural refrigerants include CO2 itself, hydrocarbons like propane and isobutane, as well as things like ammonia, right? Which was actually used very early on as a refrigerant. It's toxic and it smells really bad, but it has zero global warming potential and is often used in big warehouses, like in Costco, for example, in Costco distribution warehouses, and ice rinks for that matter too. And I think we can view this, right, as a series of big events like Montreal Protocol, Kigali Amendment, all linked with these bridges, right, from one chemical to another. And one thing that we have to be aware of is that we think of bridges, as just this transition phase, right? But really, bridges sometimes end up being like permanent infrastructure, things that stick around for a long time. And in this sense, we should be worried that we went from CFCs to HFCs, and from HFCs to perhaps these synthetic substitutes created by the same companies that invented the CFCs and HCFCs and HFCs. So we should be conscious of how do we solve this issue permanently? How do we stop building bridges from one chemical substitute to the next? And currently, people are kind of worried about these new generation HFOs because first, they have, when you produce them, they have some toxic byproducts that can accumulate in the environment. And secondly, people worry that because they're so closely related to HFCs, they might be released into the atmosphere, seemingly have no climate effects in the short run, but over time, as these chemicals break down, they might turn into HFCs in the atmosphere. So we have to be really conscious from a chemistry perspective, and a lot of this materials has yet to be peer reviewed, but we need to be conscious that we aren't going to have to build another bridge in 20 or 30 years to transition away from HFOs. And that's why some of us in the environmental community working on refrigerants are really strong advocates for natural refrigerants, like the propanes, CO2s, and ammonias of this world, which have none of these other synthetic chemical concerns attached to them. And it continues to be an ongoing debate about which refrigerant should be used. But the point is, the problem has a pretty promising direction because we have all these good alternatives, but they're imperfect in different ways.
Sure. Well, Tilden, I want to get close to wrapping this up. You've given us such a phenomenal, I would far beyond an introduction to the subject, a fairly deep dive, I think, into for folks, especially folks who are unfamiliar with this topic. Are there, well, as I said, I'll be including links in the description of the video for folks to follow and learn more. I've talked about your NRDC article. I'll include the podcast that you did with the Cornell folks. What other resources, and you can send me some after the interview, of course, too, and I'll include them, but just off the top of your head, in terms of, one that comes to me is, is there a place that people can go to learn who's using which of these refrigerants now, or with a percent? Yeah. What resources would you like to share with the audience that come to mind now that we could link to as well?
Sure. Yeah. Well, first I note that I'm super grateful to be on this series, but also I'm not even one of the leading contributors in this field of refrigerant management. There are lots of different people and different groups working on this issue. I'll highlight a couple of them. The first is called the Environmental Investigation Agency. It's known as EIA. And EIA, among other things, works on refrigerant-related issues. So in the past, they've uncovered a lot of big stories about refrigerants that have appeared in big newspapers like the Washington Post. Most recently, they exposed big refrigerant leakage from supermarkets in the DC area, like Walmart. And they also work on different petitions against the NHL, most recently, for committing to use this greenwashed refrigerant in all their ice rinks. And they also run this campaign called the climate-friendly supermarkets campaign. And I can provide the link to everybody after this. But the point is with their program is that they have this big map of the United States and actually of the whole world. And all of us can go to our supermarkets, look inside the refrigerated cases, take a picture of the information that's inside those cases, upload it to the map, and then it populates the map with these little different pins that all show which supermarkets in the world are using HFCs, which of them are using a mix of HFCs and something better, and which supermarkets are truly the best, best supermarkets in terms of refrigerant sustainability and using these low global warming potential substitutes. So it's currently a lot of red dots indicating that we're using still a lot of HFC, but it's still useful to note which are the green dots and where adoption is happening. So that's one source. The other is from the Institute for Governance and Sustainable Development, known as IGSD, one of the really early groups working on Montreal Protocol, CFCs, HCFCs, and HFCs. And what they have is something called the Climate Friendly Cooling Campaign. And what this Climate Friendly Cooling Campaign does is they produce big lists of refrigerators and air conditioners and all sorts of equipment like heat pumps too, that use climate-friendly refrigerants. So this is a really good way as a consumer and thinking about, okay, well, I'm just buying a house or I'm trying to replace my refrigerator. What kind of stuff can I buy that won't have this negative impact on climate, at least from a refrigerants perspective? Yeah. And lastly, I'll highlight that this work occurs at many levels. I work on the university level and also on some other fun initiatives at the national or international level too. But also at the state level, there are plenty of groups working on refrigerants, including New Yorkers for Cool Refrigerant Management, NY for Cool, sometimes as it's known. Lots of activists, especially in the Hudson Valley, who are working to mitigate refrigerant emissions and also provide ideas to our state government on how to better manage refrigerants. So there's a lot of work being done on all levels, local, state, and national and international levels in containing these gases. So it's a lot of exciting stuff going on and plenty of directions that we citizens and we, normal people who aren't necessarily in big environmental NGOs can do too.
Yeah. Well, yes, and you're being humble for yourself, I think, given, the incredible work you're doing, and I know, you are where you are, but I included you in this series for a very good reason, because, for you to be doing what you're doing, and taking such initiative on such a huge problem, I think it's just fantastic, and I think inspiring, and I think hopefully will inspire others to pick up the challenge and take the work forward. On the resources, I would include the audience who watch this video to include in the comments for the video. Tilden mentioned a few resources and a New York State initiative. If you're aware of other such resources in other state or local or regional initiatives on the cooling front, on the on the refrigerants front, please feel free to include them in the comment section. On that note, Tilden, I should say we should say goodbye. Thank you so much for joining us on Heroes of the 21st Century, and best of luck with all the wonderful work you're doing.
Thanks so much, James. A pleasure to be with you and really glad to appear. And I'll maybe just say one more thing, which is Absolutely. That to all young people watching this too, I just think back to myself 4 years ago, just as this high school student looking to get involved with things. And if you asked me then, do you think you'll be working on refrigerants in 4 years? I would have said absolutely no. But I think the fact that I entered this without any pre-existing knowledge about refrigerants, and it seemed like this technical, inaccessible world, you should know that you can just spend a little time learning about a specific climate issue, learn about the challenges, learn about the barriers, learn about the opportunities, and then look for ways to use your place, whether it's in a university or just as a citizen, to pull different levers of power to get stuff done. And that's what I've learned through this refrigerants project, and it's been a lot of fun so far. So whatever it may be, doesn't have to be refrigerants, good to get involved, and it's definitely possible.
Fantastic, and I can't think of better words to end on. Thank you so much.
Thanks, James. Appreciate it.